An ordinary grocery trip transformed into an unforgettable showdown on a sunny afternoon in a small Ohio neighborhood. A place where everyone knew one another and daily routines usually unfolded without incident. On that fateful day, however, the hum of shoppers and the steady rhythm of daily errands were about to be disrupted in the most unexpected way. Near the produce section, an elderly woman, probably in her late 70s with carefully pinned silver hair and a faded cardigan, stood adjusting her glasses. Her expression was one of impatient irritation, and she muttered under her breath as she reached for a bag of apples. To any casual observer, she might have seemed unassuming, even frail. Yet, moments later, her demeanor would spark an encounter that changed the mood of the entire store. At the same time, a young black man named Darryl, tall, dressed casually in a blue hoodie and jeans, approached the same produce stand, reaching for a bag of oranges. Darryl moved with an easy, unhurried confidence, his calm and polite manner blending effortlessly into the store's flow. He was busy texting on his phone while balancing a basket full of groceries. Then, without warning, everything changed. The elderly woman suddenly turned sharply, her eyes locking on Darryl. In a flash, her expression shifted, her eyes narrowed, her lips pursed tightly, and in a voice loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear, she spat, "You people don't belong here." For a brief, suspended moment, Darryl's fingers froze over his phone. When he looked up, the woman continued, her tone even sharper and more cutting. "Why don't you go back to Africa, where you came from?" The air in the aisle seemed to thicken instantly, and a couple of shoppers nearby halted in their tracks, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Others pretended not to hear, but the usual rhythm of the store fell silent, replaced by an awkward stillness that stretched on far too long. For a moment, Darryl's reaction was pure shock. His brow furrowed, and it appeared he might immediately retort. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath. His face remained unreadable, as if he were carefully weighing every possible response, while the woman, still clutching her bag of apples, stood her ground, unapologetically and firmly. The tension was palpable, and every person within earshot could feel the weight of her words. A young mother quickly steered her child away from the confrontation, and an older man near the potatoes glanced nervously at Darryl, silently urging him to respond. Yet the silence that followed was heavier than any spoken word. For a long, suspended moment, Darryl stood completely still, gripping the handle of his grocery basket as the world around him seemed to shrink. Every sound in the store was muffled, and every face turned in his direction as if trying to absorb the gravity of the moment. The force of the woman's words hung in the air like a bad smell that no one could escape. The elderly woman, for her part, did not back down. Her stance was defiant, as though she expected no argument. She adjusted her cardigan with a huff and lifted her chin in a way that challenged him to respond. A young employee, stacking bananas a few feet away, froze mid-mashon, uncertain whether to intervene, while a cashier craned her neck to catch a better view. The growing crowd neither moved closer nor dispersed. They were there to witness what was unfolding. Darryl. Darryl's name echoed in his mind as he regarded the woman, glanced at her with a calm, steady expression, his eyes full of thoughtful resolve. In that charged silence, thousands of potential reactions raced through his mind. He could lash out, yell, or storm off, but none of those options felt right. The tension pressed on him like a physical weight, yet he refused to break. Instead, he shifted his basket to his other hand and straightened his posture, his presence expanding in the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but deliberate, cutting through the oppressive atmosphere with measured precision. "Mum, do you even realize what you just said?" His question was not accusatory but reflective, as if he were giving her a chance to consider her own words. Yet the woman's response was immediate and unyielding. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising sharply. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." At that moment, a young woman near the bread aisle audibly gasped, and the quiet murmur of the assembled crowd grew louder still. Despite the rising volume of whispers and murmurs, Darryl remained steady. He did not raise his voice or take a step closer. Instead, he let the silence stretch, allowing her words to settle into the ears of everyone present. After a long pause, he finally nodded slowly and said, "All right, let's talk about that, since you brought it up." The room held its collective breath, waiting for his response. The tension was electric, a storm on the horizon that was not the kind anyone had expected. Darryl shifted his weight and carefully set his basket down on the floor. His calm demeanor was almost disarming, unsettling in its quiet strength. It felt as if his calmness were a force of gravity pulling everyone closer, even those who pretended not to listen. He fixed his gaze on the elderly woman, not with anger but with a quiet determination. That gaze made her shift uncomfortably. "You said I don't belong here," he began steadily. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." His words carried weight, each one as carefully chosen as if it were a treasured secret. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," he said, pausing just long enough to let the words sink in. "He was a sharecropper, working on land he didn't own, breaking his back so that his children might have a better life." His voice softened as he continued. "And his father, my great-great-grandfather's father, was a slave. He was kidnapped, beaten, and sold like property, all in the service of building the very country you're standing in." The woman's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Meanwhile, the crowd was transfixed. A man near the dairy section who had been idly glancing at his phone put it down entirely. An older couple exchanged whispered comments, their eyes never leaving Darryl. "My grandfather," Darryl continued, his voice gaining strength, "fought in World War II. He fought for a country that sent him overseas to risk his life, only to treat him like dirt when he came back. He couldn't sit at the same counters, couldn't drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. You know why?" He paused, letting the silence emphasize his next words. "Because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him." A hush fell over the room. Even the hum of the refrigerators seemed to quiet in deference. "And my parents," he went on, his tone softening yet remaining resolute. "They fought too, not with guns or fists, but by working every day to raise me to believe in kindness, respect, and hard work. My mother was a teacher who spent her whole life helping kids, no matter what they looked like. My father was a mechanic, the kind of man who'd stop on the side of the road to help someone like you if your car broke down." As his words settled into the charged atmosphere, Darryl fixed his eyes on the woman. "So, you're telling me I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are. Maybe even more, because my family paid the price for it in blood, sweat, and tears." At that moment, the elderly woman's face flushed. Her hands trembled as she clutched her bag of apples, and she opened her mouth as if to respond, only to be cut off by the overwhelming power of Darryl's calm words. But before she could speak, Darryl continued. "I could have walked away," he said, addressing the entire crowd now. "But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us to be better than this. We must be better than words like those." His voice was steady, and the weight of his words hung heavily in the air, drawing a moment of nearly unbearable silence. For a long beat, no one moved. The woman's face became a patchwork of emotions: anger, embarrassment, and something that looked almost like shame. Glancing around, the elderly woman searched the crowd for an ally, but none came forward. Then, a middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap stepped up. "He's right," he said, his voice breaking the quiet. "We've got to be better than this." His words seemed to cast a spell over the room. An older woman near the frozen foods aisle nodded quietly. "My dad fought in that same war," she said softly, her voice trembling. "He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The murmurs in the crowd began to grow. A young cashier, no older than 20, called out from her station, "I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully. Thank you." The elderly woman, visibly flustered, clutched her cart tightly. Though she did not apologize, the fire in her eyes had dimmed, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost pleading. I didn't mean," she started, but then stopped herself. Darryl turned back to her, his expression softening. "It's not about what you meant," he said gently. "It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more." Just then, a man from the deli counter clapped slowly. His hesitant applause soon swelled into something undeniable as others joined in. People clapped not just for Darrell's words, but for the courage it took to confront hate with dignity. The elderly woman looked around one last time, her face pale, before quietly wheeling her cart toward the exit. A few people moved to comfort Darrell. A woman placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." Darrell smiled faintly, lifting his basket back into his hand. "Sometimes," he murmured almost to himself, "it's not about winning or losing, it's about making sure people hear the truth." Slowly the crowd began to disperse. The tension in the air gave way to a reflective calm. Some people looked inspired, others thoughtful, and everyone seemed changed, even if only in small ways. The moment had passed, but the impact of Darrell's words was far from over. What happened next would leave a lasting impression on everyone present, as the atmosphere in the grocery store felt irrevocably different. Later, in the quieter moments after the incident, Darrell finished his shopping with measured steps. At the checkout line, the young cashier who had spoken up earlier scanned his items with a shy smile. "What you said back there, it meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, especially with such grace," she said, her voice filled with quiet admiration. Darrell smiled in return, his tone warm. Sometimes, grace is the only way to break through, because anger just builds walls. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Darrell walked to his car. He noticed the elderly woman sitting in her own vehicle, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, he thought about approaching her, but he decided against it. Some lessons, he knew, take time to settle, and he had already said what needed to be said. That evening, as Darrell sat with his father at the kitchen table recounting the day's events, his father, a man of few words, listened intently with his hands folded on the table. "You did the right thing, son," his father said quietly. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. People like her might not change overnight, but you planted a seed. That's all you can do. Sometimes, you plant the seed and let it grow." Darrell nodded slowly. His father's words resonated deeply within him, reinforcing the truth that while the encounter had been uncomfortable, it was necessary. Ignorance does not change unless confronted, and silence only allows it to fester. Across town, the elderly woman sat at her dining table, staring at an untouched plate of food, lost in thought. Over the following days, Darrell's words replayed in the minds of many. For the elderly woman, each phrase cut through the armor of her long-held assumptions. She began to question the beliefs that had defined her for so long, even as whispers of the incident spread through the neighborhood. People talked about Darrell's calm yet powerful response, the courage and dignity with which he handled the situation. What had begun as an isolated incident grew into a lesson, a reminder of the power of words and the importance of standing up for what is right. Strangers approached Darrell in the days that followed, sharing their own stories of prejudice and resilience. His quiet stand had sparked conversations that had long been avoided, and even the elderly woman, though initially unyielding, started to show signs of change. She began to wonder if she might one day have the courage to apologize, a thought that unsettled her deeply. In the weeks that followed, Darrell's encounter became a catalyst for broader community discussions. At local meetings, church gatherings, and even school events, people reflected on the incident, discussing the impact of hurtful words and the transformative power of kindness and understanding. Social media buzzed with posts and messages, echoing Darrell's sentiment. Your words and actions matter. They can hurt or they can heal. They can divide or they can unite. Inspired by the incident, a local community center organized a Voices of Respect event, inviting residents to share their experiences with prejudice and to discuss how empathy and open dialogue could help mend divisions. Darrell was invited to speak, and on a crisp autumn evening, he stood before a diverse audience of neighbors, community leaders, and activists. His speech was measured and heartfelt, recounting the events of that fateful afternoon, the hurtful words he had heard, and the profound lessons he had learned about dignity and respect. As he spoke, the room fell into a reflective silence, broken only by the soft applause that followed each thoughtful pause. During the Q&A session, an elderly gentleman stood up and said, "I was one of those who watched in silence that day. Your words made me think, really think, about the way I treat people. Thank you, son." The response was met with warm nods and a few tears. Daryl's message had not only resonated with the younger generation, but had also reached those who had been set in their ways for far too long. Meanwhile, the elderly woman who had spoken those hurtful words found herself grappling with an inner turmoil. At first, she dismissed the incident as nothing more than a minor scuffle, but as days turned into weeks, the memory of Daryl's calm defiance began to haunt her. In quiet moments at home, she recalled the piercing gaze in his eyes and the steady conviction in his voice. Alone, she would sit by her window, staring at the busy street below, wondering if perhaps she had been wrong all along. Late at night, as the house grew silent, she would replay the confrontation in her mind, each word echoing with a new, painful clarity. One chilly evening, as she sat alone at her kitchen table, the woman picked up her phone and hesitantly dialed a number. It was a local community center, and after a few rings, a gentle voice answered. "Hello?" she said softly. I'd like to speak with someone about an incident at the grocery store," she managed. The voice on the other end was warm and understanding, inviting her to share her story. Over the next hour, she spoke openly about her feelings of anger and fear, but also about the slow, dawning realization that her harsh words might have been born from a lifetime of prejudice. The conversation, though difficult, planted a seed of change within her, a seed of hope that perhaps, one day, she might be able to apologize and make amends. As the seasons changed, the impact of that grocery store showdown rippled throughout the community. Stories of personal transformation emerged. People who had once harbored quiet biases began to confront their assumptions. Local businesses hosted workshops on diversity and inclusion, and school counselors incorporated lessons on empathy and respect into their curricula. Daryl continued his daily routines, but he carried with him the knowledge that even a brief moment of dignity could spark change. His reputation grew, not just as a delivery driver, but as a quiet activist whose actions spoke volumes about the power of calm resistance. One day, several months after the incident, Daryl received an invitation to speak at a regional conference on civil rights and community healing. The invitation noted his courage and the ripple effect his response had caused. At the conference, Daryl shared his personal journey from his childhood in a modest neighborhood to the challenges he faced as a young man confronting prejudice in everyday life. He spoke about the importance of listening, of understanding that every person carries a story, and how a single act of respectful defiance can change minds and hearts. During his keynote address, Daryl recounted the events of that day in Ohio with vivid clarity. "I was just doing my job," he said, his voice steady and full of conviction. "But that day I realized that every word we speak matters. They can build bridges or burn them down. I chose to speak calmly, because anger only builds walls." His speech was met with thunderous applause, and many in the audience approached him afterward to express their gratitude and to share how his story had inspired them to stand up against prejudice in their own lives. Back in his neighborhood, Daryl's story continued to have a transformative effect. A local newspaper published an in-depth profile of him, highlighting both the incident and his ongoing work in the community. The article, laden with quotes from neighbors, community leaders, and even the previously unrepentant elderly woman, became a catalyst for change. In interviews, she admitted, albeit tearfully, that she had begun to question the assumptions that had governed her life. "I've been taught to fear what is different," she confessed in a rare moment of vulnerability. "But I'm learning that sometimes difference can be beautiful." Inspired by these events, a grassroots organization was formed to promote racial reconciliation and community unity. The organization held monthly gatherings in local community centers, where people of all ages and backgrounds could come together to discuss their experiences, share their stories, and commit to building a more inclusive future. Daryl was invited to serve on the board of this new initiative, and he embraced the opportunity with humility and determination. "We may never erase the past," he said in one meeting, "but we can create a future where every person is valued for who they are." In one particularly moving gathering, an elderly man recounted how, in his youth, he had witnessed similar moments of prejudice but had been too afraid to speak up. "I was a silent bystander for too long," he admitted, his voice trembling with regret. "But your words, they remind me that change begins with us." The room fell silent, and in that silence, a shared understanding of the power of human connection emerged. Over time, the neighborhood began to change. The grocery store, once just a backdrop for daily routines, became a symbol of transformation. Shoppers greeted one another with newfound warmth, and the aisles that had once echoed with whispers of division now resonated with laughter and friendly conversation. Even the employees who had once spoken in hushed tones of disdain started to treat one another with respect and kindness. Darrell's calm dignity became a beacon for many, and his story spread far beyond his small neighborhood. Social media posts, local news segments, and community blogs echoed his message that every word, every act of respect holds the power to transform lives. Schools began incorporating his story into lessons on empathy and social justice, and local businesses sponsored community events aimed at bridging divides. One crisp autumn day, as Darrell made his regular delivery route, he was greeted not with jeers or mocking laughter, but with nods of respect and smiles. A group of teenagers waved at him, and an elderly couple thanked him for his service. In that moment, Darrell felt a quiet pride, an affirmation that the seed he had planted was beginning to grow into something much larger than he had ever imagined. Later that year, at a community festival celebrating diversity and unity, Darrell was invited to receive a community award for courage and resilience. As he stood on the stage accepting the award, he looked out at the crowd, faces lit by the soft glow of autumn twilight, and spoke from the heart. "I never set out to change the world," he said. "I only wanted to do my job with dignity. But when you treat each other with respect, you create ripples that can turn into waves of change. Let us all strive to be better, to listen more, and to speak with kindness. Because in the end, our words and our actions define us." The applause that followed was heartfelt and genuine, a clear signal that the community had begun to embrace the ideals Darrell championed. His journey, from the grocery store incident to becoming a local symbol of hope and unity, had inspired countless others to stand up against prejudice and to treat every individual with the respect they deserved. As the seasons turned and the community continued to evolve, Darrell's story remained a constant reminder of the transformative power of dignity and compassion. The grocery store, once the stage for a painful confrontation, had become a place of reflection and renewed purpose. People no longer took for granted the simple act of showing respect. They recognized that even small gestures could have profound, lasting impacts. In the months that followed, the elderly woman who had once shouted those hurtful words began to make subtle changes. Though it was a slow process, neighbors noticed her softening gaze and a slight change in her tone when she interacted with others. One day, as she was leaving the store, a young man approached her gently. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you for listening," he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, as if realizing for the first time that change was possible, even in her own heart. Meanwhile, Darrell continued his work with quiet determination. Every delivery, every encounter, became an opportunity to demonstrate that respect and dignity could overcome even the deepest-rooted prejudice. His interactions with community members grew more frequent, and his simple yet powerful message, "Your words and actions matter," began to resonate on a wider scale. Local radio stations and community newspapers picked up the story, and soon Darrell was invited to speak at town hall meetings and public forums. At one such meeting, held in a modest community center, Darrell addressed an audience that included both long-time residents and newcomers alike. "I know that sometimes the past casts a long shadow over our lives," he said, his voice steady and compassionate. "But we have the power to choose how we move forward. Let's choose to build bridges, not walls. Let's choose kindness over judgment. Each of us has a story worth listening to, and every voice matters." The discussions that followed were intense and emotional, but they were also hopeful. Neighbors exchanged stories of personal growth and forgiveness, and many vowed to challenge the prejudices that had long divided them. In one particularly memorable moment, a local teacher stood up and said, "Today, we witnessed not just a confrontation, but the birth of a new conversation, a conversation about how we treat one another and what kind of community we want to build." Her words were met with applause and nods of agreement. As the years passed, the impact of that day in the grocery store continued to ripple through the community. Daryl's experience became a case study in local schools, a topic for discussion in community groups, and a reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult. The story, shared and reshared across social media and community newsletters, inspired many to reflect on their own attitudes and behaviors. Daryl, who had once been known simply as a delivery driver, gradually became recognized as a local leader, a symbol of quiet strength and resilience in the face of injustice. His journey was far from over, and every day he continued to work, he carried with him the lessons of that fateful afternoon. He understood that change does not happen overnight, but that every kind word and every respectful gesture help to build a better future. In a poignant twist of fate, one day Daryl received a letter in the mail from the elderly woman who had once hurled those hateful words at him. The letter was written in careful, trembling handwriting. In it, she apologized for her hurtful remarks and expressed her hope that she could someday make amends. "I have come to understand," the letter read, "that the words we choose define us far more than our actions alone. I am learning that respect and kindness have the power to heal wounds I never knew existed. I hope you can forgive me, and I promise to strive to be a better person." When Daryl read the letter, he felt a profound mixture of emotions: compassion, relief, and a deep sense of vindication. Here was someone who, after all the years, had finally begun to question her long-held beliefs. In a quiet moment of reflection, he decided that forgiveness was the final, necessary step in healing the wounds of the past. He wrote back, thanking her for her courage in facing her own demons, and expressing his hope that both of them could continue to learn and grow from the experience. The exchange between Daryl and the elderly woman became a symbol of reconciliation, a testament to the possibility of change even in the most entrenched of hearts. Their correspondence was shared anonymously in community meetings, and it sparked further dialogue among residents about the importance of empathy and understanding. In the following months, the story of Daryl's encounter in the grocery store continued to be a catalyst for transformation. Community leaders organized workshops on implicit bias, and local businesses sponsored initiatives aimed at promoting diversity and inclusion. Daryl was invited to participate in panels and discussions on civil rights, and his calm, reasoned voice became a beacon of hope for those who had long felt marginalized. One crisp winter evening, during a community holiday event held in a large town hall, Daryl was asked to speak about his experiences. Standing before a diverse crowd under twinkling lights and festive decorations, he recounted the events of that day with honesty and humility. "That day," he said, "I was faced with words that sought to define me by my skin color rather than my character. But I learned that our response to hate defines us more than the hate itself. I chose to respond with calm and conviction, and that choice not only changed the moment, it changed my community." This presence became my tuition. His words resonated deeply with the audience, and by the end of his speech, many were moved to tears. The event became an annual tradition, a reminder of the power of standing up for what is right, and each year more people attended, eager to share their own stories of transformation and hope. As spring arrived and the town bloomed anew, the grocery store, where it all began, became a kind of informal community hub. Shoppers who once passed by without a second glance now greeted each other warmly, and even the store employees seemed more attentive and respectful in their interactions. Daryl, now recognized by many, would often stop to chat with regulars, his smile a quiet assurance that change was possible. Meanwhile, Daryl's own life continued to evolve. He enrolled in community college courses on social justice and leadership, determined to deepen his understanding of the very issues that had sparked his journey. Balancing work and study was challenging, but he found purpose in learning more about history, sociology, and the art of communication. His newfound knowledge further empowered him to advocate for change, not only through his words but through informed action. In one of his classes, a professor remarked, "True leadership is not about imposing your will on others, it's about inspiring change through empathy and understanding." Daryl took those words to heart. He began to mentor younger students, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to stand up against prejudice, no matter how subtle. "Your voice matters," he would tell them, And every time you choose kindness over anger, you're paving the way for a more just world. By the time summer rolled around, the impact of Daryl's actions had spread beyond his immediate community. Local news outlets featured his story, and what had once been a single incident in a grocery store became a national conversation about racism, dignity, and the transformative power of compassion. Daryl was invited to speak on television panels and participate in nationwide forums where he reiterated his message that respect, kindness, and the courage to stand up against hate are essential for creating a better society. Back at the grocery store, life continued with a newfound sense of awareness. Regular shoppers often exchanged knowing looks, and the once awkward silence that had followed Daryl's initial confrontation was now replaced with a subtle understanding, a collective recognition that words have power and that even small acts of dignity can have far-reaching consequences. In a quiet moment one afternoon, as Daryl pushed his cart through the familiar aisles, he caught the eye of an elderly man who nodded at him in silent approval. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Across the store, a young mother smiled at her child and whispered, "That man is very brave." These moments, fleeting as they were, reaffirmed Daryl's belief that change was happening, one interaction at a time. As the months passed, the legacy of that day became interwoven with the fabric of the community. Schools began to use Daryl's story as a teaching tool, illustrating the importance of empathy, the courage to speak up, and the impact of our everyday actions. Community centers hosted events and open forums, where people from all walks of life gathered to discuss ways to foster unity and respect. Even local businesses joined in, sponsoring diversity training sessions and community outreach programs. One evening, during a community-wide celebration of cultural diversity, Daryl was honored with an award for civic courage. At the award ceremony, held in the town's community center and attended by people of all ages and backgrounds, Daryl's speech was simple yet powerful. "I never intended for that day to define me," he said, his voice. The audience erupted into applause, and back at home as Daryl sat with his family that evening, he reflected on the journey that had begun on that ordinary grocery trip. He recalled the hurtful words, the heavy silence that had followed, and the unexpected outpouring of support from strangers and neighbors alike. In the quiet moments, Daryl's story became a testament to the idea that our actions can resonate far beyond the moment in which they occur. He learned that while ignorance might be deeply rooted, it could. In the years that followed, Daryl continued to work as a D. On a particularly memorable day, during a community forum on diversity and inclusion, an attendee asked, "What is the one thing you wish everyone knew?" Daryl paused, his eyes reflecting both pain and hope, and replied, "That every word we speak matters. Our words can heal or they can hurt. They can build bridges or they can build walls. I choose to speak with kindness and to stand for what." As his words echoed through the hall, the audience sat in thoughtful silence, absorbing the truth of his message. In that moment, the impact of that long-ago grocery store showdown was felt not only by Daryl but by everyone present. It was a call to action, a reminder that every individual has the power to challenge prejudice and to forge connections built on respect and ease. The legacy of Daryl's encounter eventually extended far beyond his local community. His story was featured in regional news broadcasts, discussed in academic settings, and even inspired works of art and literature. People from diverse backgrounds shared how his quiet defiance had influence. Meanwhile, the elderly woman who had once shouted those. As spring blossomed in the neighborhood, the atmosphere in the local grocery store took on a new, more reflective quality. Shoppers, staff, and even the management began to. By the time summer returned, the ripple effects of that fateful afternoon were evident everywhere. Local schools incorporated lessons on empathy and the power of respectful dialogue, and community centers hosted panels on confronting prejudice with kindness. Daryl, now a recognized figure in his community, found himself in one memorable community event, a local. Through it all, Daryl remained humble. He continued to deliver groceries, to smile at neighbors, and to act with the same quiet dignity that had once silenced a room. Yet his influence grew steadily, as more people recognized that his courage had sparked a wave of positive change. In time, Daryl's message reached even the broader regional and national media, prompting discussions on television talk shows, in newspapers, and on social media platforms. Interviews with Darrell revealed his deep belief that respect and kindness were not just abstract ideal. One afternoon, during a live radio interview, a caller asked Darrell, "What keeps you going, even after facing so much hostility?" Darrell paused and replied, "I believe in the promise of this country, a promise that every person deserves respect, no matter who they are or where the..." That call resonated with listeners, and soon the station was flooded with messages from people sharing their own stories of overcoming prejudice. Darrell's words became a rallying cry for a movement dedicated to building bridges between communities and here. As the years went by, the initial incident in the grocery store became a turning point, not just for Darrell but for the entire community. The neighborhood, once divided by subtle biases and unspoken assumptions, began to unite around a common vision of empathy and equality. Community leaders, educators, and local business owners joined forces to create programs that encouraged cultural exchange. Darrell continued to be an active voice in these efforts. At one point, he helped organize a Day of Unity event in which people of all ages and backgrounds came together for a day of shared activities, workshops, and open forums. The event was Throughout all this, the impact of that ordinary grocery trip, transformed by one brave, dignified response, remained a testament to the power of words and the importance of standing up for what is right. Darrell's calm demeanor, his measured voice, and his willingness to confront hate with truth had not only altered the course of a single day, but had also sown seeds of change that continued to grow in the hearts and minds of those around him. In every conversation that followed, in every community meeting, and in every quiet moment of reflection, the lesson was clear. Our words and actions have the power to hurt or to heal, to divide or to unite. Let this story serve as a reminder